Okay, so greetings to everyone. Shalom to all. Thank you for joining. Thanks, first of all, to Ariel in Cape Town, who is making this happen technically. Thanks to Bina Kint in London. I think she's also with us, making sure that we function technically. And we start, as usual, just by introducing this couple of days before Pesach, 5783. And this is a webinar for primarily people who are members of our newsletter, signed up at our website. And I start, as usual, by thanking everyone who participates in that. First of all, just for your interest and keeping my activities going and being a forum for learning and teaching Torah. And I want to make a special thank you to those who contribute financially. I like to make it plain, as I always do. There's no need to do that. There is a option at the website to make contributions, and I must say hundreds of people have done that, which keeps us going. I just published a new book, as you know, and the finances go towards that sort of thing. I'm working on other books. So number one, no one should feel obliged to make any contribution. This is not for that purpose, but of course it does take money to run. And so I try to do these events before every Yom Tov in order to meet people and to say a special thank you for participation, especially for those who make contributions. I have a new book out. I don't know if everyone knows. Let me show you a copy. Why not do a little shameless self-promotion? This book just came out, Shabbat and the Festivals, Shabbos and the Festivals. And if you can see that clearly. So it just reached the stores in England and the United States. And so just this week, in fact. So I'll simply say that it's indispensable. You'll never be the same if you read it. And of course, there's no hope for you if you don't read it. You also need to buy at least one copy for a friend as well. And then, of course, you'll be a highly successful individual. Anyway, the point is that I'd like to welcome friends. I'm not going to greet people by name because I'll definitely leave out somebody and I can't see everybody on one screen. So let's talk for a few minutes about Pesach and see if we can lift ourselves into a different space, something a bit more sophisticated than we are used to thinking. And not that you could share every detail of this, maybe at your side, maybe not suitable for those who are very young, but at least to give us a little bit of perhaps elevated thinking. You know, I'm sure that the essence of Pesach in practice is talking. The mitzvah of the day is Haggadah, which means to tell. And of course, the practical mitzvah, Torah mitzvah of the day is called Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. That is the telling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And therefore, the central work of the day, or the night, if you like, is telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Not only that, but the other aspects of the Seder, eating matzah and eating maror and drinking the cups of wine, they all are done around the story. In other words, these are accoutrements, if you like. These are, so to speak, ancillary in some way. These are the show and tell or the dramatization elements of the story. And therefore, the real central issue here is to tell the story. Obviously, the focus is telling children, passing on to the next generation. But the law is, the din is, of course, if there are no children, you tell whoever's present. And of course, if there's no one else but you tell yourself the story. So the mitzvah here is to tell over the story. And that is couched, of course, in the activity of talking. And I'd like to try to explore that with you as much as time and energy allow and see if we can reach something a little bit deeper. We begin with a concept, very difficult and mysterious concept, which is phrased in the Zohar, the central repository of Kabbalistic teaching. The Zohar says that in Egypt, speech was in exile. Speech was in exile. That's known as Galut Hadibur, Golus Hadibur. Speech was in exile. And in fact, what was redeemed from Egypt was the faculty of talking. This obviously needs explanation. What is this abstraction? What does it mean? Let's see if we can explore it together. You know that the month of Nissan is the month of speech. You know that the Sefer Yetzirah, very, very ancient Kabbalistic source, The Sefer Yetzirah goes through the 12 months of the year and expresses what each one connects to in terms of an organ or limb in the body, and also faculty of the human being. So 1 month corresponds to seeing, one is to walking, one is to hearing. There are 12 months of the year. Each of them vests, so to speak, in a different organ, obviously corresponds to one of the tribes, one of the 12 tribes. Obviously, anyone who knows anything about Judaism knows that there are 12 manifestations. But one of the sets of 12 is faculties. And the faculty of Nissan, which is the first month of the year, according to the Torah, the faculty that's associated with the month of Nissan is speech. The obvious application of that, the obvious connection, doesn't take much thought, is that the pinnacle of the month, which is the 15th of the month, on which we are telling the story, obviously the mitzvah is to tell the story. Anyone who knows anything about Judaism must know that the word Pesach actually is a word that if said slowly and clearly, is Pesach, which means the mouth tells, right? What could be better than that? And of course, the Haggadah is the mitzvah of telling, as we said, and of course, that's the central expression of the speech of the month of Nisan. But what's beneath the surface here? Or as we always like to say, why are things that way? Why is the first month of the year the faculty of speech? Why not seeing? Why not hearing? Why not walking? Why is the year beginning with the activity of speaking? Why is it that the battle in Egypt is over speech? In what sense do the Egyptians capture the faculty of speech? And in what sense is it liberated when we leave Egypt? I'm sure your minds are racing ahead, and I'm sure you're thinking through a number of parameters that connect with this. One of the most obvious ones, which I'm sure you're all thinking of, is that the great spokesman of the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu, was unable to speak. What better indication of an exile of speech, or a captivity, holding in, right? The great leader of the Jewish people. And after all, we do call a leader a spokesman. And classically in Judaism, Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who spoke out the Torah to us. And yet, amazingly and paradoxically, he cannot speak. There are many reasons for this. There's a famous, perhaps the most famous and best known is the Ran, who says that the reason that Moshe Rabbeinu could not speak is because it is well known that a very potent orator can sway people. And lest history would accuse us of being swayed by a potent speaker, so Moshe Rabbeinu, paradoxically and amazingly, is a man who cannot speak, so that there's no suspicion at all later in history that we were swayed by a charismatic leader, but rather the events must have spoken for themselves. And there are many other takes on this. The deepest one, the deepest famous explanation, which is much more relevant to our theme today, is the Maharal. The Maharal says that the reason that Moses could not speak was not an imperfection, but a perfection. He explains that Moses was living in a world, Moshe Rabbeinu was living in a world where things are understood in their essence, what we call be'etzem, and things that are grasped internally can never be put into words. You can never articulate a full inner experience. Of course, in the world of the practical, you certainly can. When you speak out a technical subject, a mathematics, a science subject, when you speak about a technical issue, of course you can say it. On the contrary, in a technical area, if you cannot say it, you probably didn't understand it. It's key to understanding a subject to be able to articulate it. And if it can be articulated, it's a very good sign that you understand it. But when it comes to experience, to things of inner depth, yourself, your consciousness of self, your knowledge that you're human and not an animal, your knowledge of your free will, right? Let alone matters of faith. These things can no way be put into words. Even a meaningful personal experience, a beautiful experience or an aesthetic experience, right? Something very moving in appreciation of nature. There's no way you can put those things into words. Here, the rule is the more words you need, the less chance you have of communicating it. When two people speak to each other about those things, you know, people live together for 50 years and then only begin to realize they never understood from the beginning what the other one meant. I'm talking here about men. Your wife knows what you mean despite what you say, right? Unfortunately, depends what the circumstances are. But the general rule is the more words you need to convey things like that, the less chance you have of expressing them, of communicating them. The only way you can really communicate with someone else at that level is where you don't need many words. When two people understand each other so deeply that a gesture is enough or half a word is enough, then you have a chance of communicating. But if the other person doesn't understand you and you have to start explaining, the general rule is the more words you need, the less hope you have of communicating the idea. And that's because essence cannot be put into words. And the reason for that is very well known. Words are finite, specific, particulate elements of reality. And a consciousness of a thing is beyond the finite and particulate words. Moses was living in a world of divine essence. He was living in a world in which things have their cosmic connections. He's living in a world of divine reality. Those things cannot be put into words. Not that he has a deficiency or a defect. He knows psychological problems as a child. This is not the issue. He was living in a world beyond speech, and therefore he could not bring down Torah ideas. Torah, by definition, is a connection with the infinite. He could not bring them into expression. Note that when the Jews left Egypt and the Torah was given, after that he spoke normally. As the Maharal points out, because it says, Ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe. The fifth book of the Torah was authored by Moshe, right? Not in divine dictation as the others had been given. He was fully articulate. And why? Because Torah is infinite wisdom in a finite vessel. What is Torah? Torah is infinite wisdom in a finite text. Once that miracle had been performed in the world, then a human being could do it. Again, until that time when Torah was not yet manifest in the world, the infinite could not be manifest in the finite. But when infinity makes contact with the finite, then a thing called Torah, which is an unbelievable, paradoxical, mysterious entity in the world, a finite document that reverberates and resonates with infinite wisdom, after that reality took place, Moshe could speak normally. Think for a moment how the Torah was given. The description is that God appeared on the mountain. When you're 6 years old, it means, God, a man in the sky with a long white beard, came down on the mountain. But when you're a little more sophisticated, you have to understand that God appearing on the mountain has nothing to do with that. It means the finite manifesting, the infinite manifesting in the finite. What does it mean that God appeared in the world? What does that mean? It means the infinite manifest in the finite, which is downright impossible, but it happened. And after that impossibility, Torah becomes manifest in the world, which is an infinite wisdom in a finite document. Someone's asking me why Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't speak from the first book. Indeed he could. That was only after the giving of the Torah. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu is writing down what happened previously only at that time. And therefore, it only began then. Think about that for a moment and you see the meaning. So let's track this as carefully as possible. What is the meaning of speech? Now, let's delve into this and see if we can trace it to its origin and then understand something new about this speech of Pesach. What does it mean that human beings are speaking beings? And the interest of the Egyptians is to exile the faculty of speech. And our interest is to free it. And God's interest is to free it, such that we spend the night of Pesach celebrating and reveling in talking about this. The Rambam says, unusually, the more you talk about on Pesach night, the better. Normally in Judaism, the principle is to speak short. When your words are short, they are more precious and more focused, right? It's a halacha that a teacher should teach his student in terse, short words full of meaning. And yet here, the more you speak, the better. Why? In order to understand this, let's delve into the root of what it is to be a speaking being. And the concept is this. The concept is that the human being is by definition a speaking creature, right? That's what it means to be human. Let's analyze this by following, first of all, what is the nature of speech? The nature of speech is that you take something in abstraction and connect it with the world. Right? That's the important thing to focus on. What speech is, you take something which is an idea, which has no manifestation in the world. I do not see your thoughts at all. And you express them in the world. You express them in two ways. The most sophisticated and specifically articulate is words. The action that takes place in the world is only the action of lips and tongue and organs of speech. But in truth, speech is any outward manifestation. It could be a gesture. It can be dance. It can be the way you move your body. You can act out an expression of something that is in the mind. And therefore, the broad concept of speech in Torah does not only mean what you do with your mouth. It is any expression of an abstraction in practical expression in the world. In fact, the word for speech in Hebrew is dabar, right? Dabar, divur. That Hebrew root does not mean literally speaking. It means any conscious or intelligent, controlled manifestation of an idea in practice. For example, we have an expression, dabar echad lador. It means a leader of a generation. It doesn't mean somebody who speaks. Or for example, the verse says, Yad be'er amim tachtenu, when one nation controls another, in other words, manifests its agenda. The concept of speech is taking an agenda which is abstract in thought and manifesting it in practice in the world. Not only what's done with the mouth, any expression of plan or agenda manifest outwardly. Many times, countless times, the Targum, the Aramaic Targum in the Torah uses the word dabar to mean to take and place, to manipulate or control or do something with something else that is fulfilling a plan. And therefore, that's the important thing to understand. And therefore, speech is always thoroughly a connection. Firstly, it's a connection between abstraction of idea and practical expression. Secondly, it's a manifestation of connection between people. No accident that the same faculty that connects your ideas with your outward expression also connects people. And therefore, when people get together, any interaction between people is called speaking. You probably know when the Torah wants to use a euphemism for male-female intimacy, it says speaking, right? Ra'u medaberes, they saw her speaking to a man, the Mishnah says, using clean language. He wants to talk about intimacy, and it chooses a euphemism of speaking. Why? You could have used any euphemism. The Torah always uses a euphemisms or metaphorical speech that is accurate. And speaking is a very, very intimate when I share with you what's deepest in me by an outward expression. This is also when people eat together. They form a bond. And the reason is because speaking is an act of connection. And the mouth, which is the organ of speech, has three faculties, three functions: eating, speaking, and kissing. And we have a spiritual principle that when one organ has more than one function, the organs are connected. The functions are connected. Otherwise, they would have been manifest in more than one organ, right? The nose is breathing and smelling and sneezing. And all three of those are uniquely connected. Now's not the time to go into that. But yes, Des is looking around because they didn't teach him this at medical school. You get your money back. But the important thing is that any part of the body that has more than one function, those functions are connected. What is speaking? Connection. Connection between mind and manifestation, connection between people. What is eating? Eating is the activity that keeps soul and body connected. Those very same two elements. Soul, which is abstraction and plan and theory, manifest in body. Eating keeps those two together. If you don't eat, they start to distract from one from the other. And if you don't eat long enough, they snap apart. And therefore, eating is the activity that keeps soul connected with body. And what is kissing? Kissing is using the very same organ to establish intimate connection. Why do human beings kiss each other? If you think about it, it's bizarre. It's medically hazardous. I mean, it is absolutely bizarre. You don't think it's bizarre because the first thing you were aware of was your mother, sort of, sloping her germs all over you when you were born. You thought it was cool, but it's not cool. It's weird. And all cultures do that. In all human cultures and in many cultures, men kiss each other too. It's not only, the reason is the mouth is the organ of connection. And therefore, it's no accident that in the temple, the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, which is the place of connection of higher and lower worlds, the very same three functions take place. What is the purpose of a temple? It's for humans to make contact with God. And what happens there? Speaking. From between the two golden kruvim, the voice of Hashem is heard. It's the place of sacrifices, which is where the world eats. And that's why all the sacrifices are designated as, so to speak, divine food. The altar is called Shulchan Gavoy, Hashem's table. It's called as Korbani Lachmi, my sacrifices, my bread. And Nefesh HaChaim goes into this in detail. So that is, so to speak, just like eating keeps the soul in the body, the sacrifices in the temple are keeping the soul of the world, known as the Shekhinah, in the world. And the Talmud calls it the place where heaven and earth kiss. Therefore, the same three ideas are always manifest in that way. And so speaking, being a speaking being, means being a creature, a unique creature. That's why speech is unique to human beings. The specific articulate nature of human beings is because we are able to reach up to a world of angelic abstraction and bring it down into a world of physical expression. And that is why those three functions function that way. Let's take it one step further. The speech which is manifest in the mouth originates in the neck. There's a silent origin, which is the chest, which is where the breath itself is expressed. And that perhaps another time we can discuss that level of origin. But let's take it back to the neck. The neck in Torah is always the organ that symbolizes, that manifests connection between the world of the head, which is the world of thought and abstraction, and the world of body, which is the world of practical expression. Let's ask this question. Why do you have a neck? You could have walked around like this. Why were you created with a neck? Every part of the body teaches a spiritual lesson. Its structure and its physiology and its detailed anatomy, right? Every part of the body is there to manifest a spiritual teaching. And the neck is the part of the body that uniquely is constructed. That point of the neck is that connects the world of the head and the world of the body. In Torah terminology, whenever you see the neck mentioned, it's a reference to the temple. In Shir HaShirim, for example, where he talks about this elegant woman's beauty, and he says, Kamigdal Tzavarech, like the tower of your neck. In the metaphorical language of Shir HaShirim, he's talking about the temple. Why? The neck is the structure, the vertical structure. Okay, Migdal means a vertical, in English you call it a tower. That is a vertical structure whose function is to connect the spiritual world with the physical. That's what the temple is. When it says that Yosef and Binyamin saw each other, two brothers having been separated for many years, and it says that Yosef cried on Binyamin's neck. He cried on his neck. And Rashi says he was weeping for the future destruction of the temple. How on earth does Rashi know what he's crying about? The secret is, he says, because he's crying on his neck. And that is the key to understanding that that's what the neck is. And therefore, the voice is formed in the neck. Now notice that the voice is formed in the front of the neck. You know that the front of a structure is always the side of Kedusha, right? That's a very, very deep spiritual axiom. The front is always the side of purity, where the inner depth is represented. The back is always the side of darkness and negativity. In Hebrew, the word achor, which is a back, is the same as acher, which means a stranger, the side of foreigners. The face in Hebrew is called the panim, and you don't need to know much Hebrew to know that the word panim is exactly the same word in Hebrew as panim, which means inside. Panim means outer face, and it's exactly the same word, which means inside, because the face is that part of the outside that reveals the inside. That's why the face does not need to be covered. There's no nakedness in a face, right? There's no shame that can be manifest by a face being revealed, and because it is a spiritual aspect of the human being. And that is why the face is unique to the human being. You can recognize one person out of 8 billion. I don't know if you know, but last November, we passed 8 billion population on Earth. Okay, in case you're interested. And out of those 8 billion people on Earth, you can identify everyone, even identical twins, if you know them well, by the face, not from other parts of the body. So the face is the divine aspect of the human being. And that's why the front is always the side of sanctity. The back is always the side of darkness, unrecognizability, excretion. That is the dark side and the fallen side of the human being. Notice that the voice, which is the organ, the aspect of connection between higher and lower worlds, is located in the front of the neck. If you look in Kabbalistic literature, you find that this part of the body is always called Moshe. And in some works, it's called Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Why? Because the divine being speaks, the divine spirit speaks from the throat of Moshe. He opens his mouth and Hashem speaks. The front of the neck is the sanctity of interconnection between higher and lower worlds. What's the back of the neck? In Hebrew, the back of the neck is called ha'oref. That's the word that means back of the neck. In Kabbalistic literature, when you want to see the dark side of something, you spell it backwards. That's how Hebrew works, amazingly. If you spell ha'oref backwards, it spells paroi, Pharaoh. So you see, the front of this organ of interconnectedness is Moshe, that brings Hashem's verse into the world. The back of the neck is Paroi, Mi Hashem, he says. Who's God? I don't know about him. He is there to detach, right? This is the battle. The battle between Egypt and us is a battle for whose voice, who will express the truth in the world, who will express the spiritual dimension in the world, and who will block it. Okay, that's the battle between them. Let's take it back. Let's go back one step. Let's go back to the creation of the human being. What is the format of creation of the human being? Amazingly, the Torah says that God breathed the spirit of life into the human being. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim. Hashem breathed the spirit, nishmat chaim, the neshama of chaim, the soul of life. He breathed a living soul into the human being. V'haya ha'adam lenefesh chaya. And man became, the human being became a living creature. Nefesh chaya. Nefesh is one part of the soul. It's the life-giving part of the soul, the animation part. And that became the human being. After having a divine soul infused into him, he became a living creature. The Aramaic translation, the Targum, says something amazing. He translates the Hebrew words nefesh chaya as ruach memalala, which means a speaking being. That's the translation of a living creature. Now notice two changes he makes. Now you know that a translation is always an interpretation, and the Targum is certainly giving you not simply the Aramaic equivalent, he's bringing out the meaning. Notice that he changes the word nefesh to ruach. Very interesting. Why did he do that? Nefesh means the lowest part of the soul, the living part, the part that does not leave when you're sleeping, the part that keeps you breathing and the heart beating, right? It's the physiological functions of life. That's called the nefesh. The ruach is the higher part. Ruach is one step above nefesh. Ruach is the part where your consciousness resides, not simply the physiological functions of life. This is where we call what we call in English your mind, the mind and its capacity to think and to reason, right? That and where free will resides, that's called the ruach. Now notice what the Targum did. He had the word nefesh chaya, a living being, and he translated as a ruach. Very interesting. Why did he see fit to translate the basic function of life into the higher function of ruach? And then he calls it ruach mamalala, a speaking being. This means clearly that the identity of the human as being alive in the world, the human fulfilling what it is to be a human, is to be a speaking being. And the word ruach always means the agency of speech. Again, without going into too much detail, notice that the word ruach means air moving. Okay, nefesh means where the soul comes to rest, vayinafash, where the soul comes to rest. The one step above that, which is called ruach, always means, in Hebrew, ruach means a wind. Wind, by definition, is air moving. You can't have a still wind. So wind means where air moves. And speech is the process of movement. It is generated, the carrier wave, if you like. The mode of speaking is the production of breath, which is then vocalized. So ruach means the part of the spirit that is moving, and it's a speaking being. So here is the definition of a human being. The definition of a human being is a creature who can speak. And that is the essence. And why is that so? Well, let's go back one step further. How did God create the world in the first place? How did Hashem create the world? He spoke it into being. He manifests his own being in speech. When it says Vayomer Elokim, it is childish to think that he gave instruction. They're translated as God said, let there be light. So, the beginner thinks it means God said, well, to whom? Well, I guess he had some helpers. Maybe he spoke to some angels, and he told them, make light. That's not what it means. Vayomer Elokim means that Hashem said the word or, he said the word light, and that manifested, crystallized, condensed into the concept of, into light. It doesn't mean he gave instruction. It means his speaking is creation, right? His speaking is a creation. Again, the way the world was created originally, the mode of creation of the world was speaking. And what did God create? A speaking being, which means a person, a creature who can also create by means of speech. Notice that the world is created in two modes. Hashem speaks it into being and acts it into being. That's why the Torah says, Vayomer Elokim, and God said, and it says, Vayas Elokim, and God did. Notice that there are two ways that Hashem expresses himself. One is he speaks and speaks things into being, and the second is that he acts, right? He performs actions with his hands, and he manifests things into being with action. How do human beings express themselves in the world? Same two modes. You can speak and you can act. These are the two modes of expression. There aren't others. You either speak, which is a more refined way of bringing a concept into the world, or you act in the world. Notice that when Hashem created the world, he did it with his voice and his hands, right? The Medrash says, the Torah says he spoke the world into existence, and it says he did, right? His hands and his fingers. How was the Torah given? Let's fast forward. The Torah was given his speech and action. God spoke the 10 Commandments, and then he gave them, carved in rock. Why did you have to do the two? The second was in case we forgot. They were carved into rock in case, Jewish people, they might forget that experience. So he wrote it down. Why do you need both? Because there are always two modes of expression. He spoke them to the Jewish people. We heard God speak, and we received them in writing, which is the action of his hands. And therefore, let's fast forward again. How does a prophet manifest in the world? When a prophet continues the story of Torah, what is a prophet doing? He's continuing the manifestation of Torah. God gave the 5 books. He gave the 5 books of Torah to Moshe and the Jewish people, but he gave us an assurance that Torah would manifest further into the future, invested in the ability of prophets to continue the story. And how does a prophet manifest in the world? 2 ways. The prophet speaks divine words, and the prophet produces miracles, divine actions, both vested in prophets. Understand this well. Prophets are for 2 reasons in the world. Somebody's looking to ask a question, but if you don't forgive me, if I stop for questions, we just won't get through this if you don't mind. So maybe I'll be able to answer your question as we go. So let me ask you, if you don't mind, just to hold that question. If there's time at the end, perhaps we can take questions. There's too many people to with your permission, to deal with questions as we go. So, apologies. So, a prophet is there to manifest ongoing Torah, and therefore a prophet manifests it in the same two ways that Torah was given originally. The prophet speaks Hashem's words, and he acts Hashem's acts in the world. The speech is called the miraculous speech that is known as Torah. The actions are known as the miraculous actions that are known as miracles, right? And therefore you will notice that both modes apply. Why Hashem needs to operate in the world when he wants to reveal Torah, he has to do it through humans, is a question I'm not going to go into now. I'll just say one clue about that, and that is because the world was created for human manifestation, not for God to show what he can do. And therefore no Torah ever manifests in the world without a human agency. Even when the Torah was given originally, Moshe Rabbeinu needed to be standing there. But that's the general principle, and therefore the two modes of expression are speech and action, and the higher one, of course, is speech. And so the human being is created as a speaking being because the world was originally created through speech. And therefore, the essence of what it means to be a human being is to be a speaking creature. The unique ability not to be angelic, but to connect the angelic with the material. By the way, that's a very important and axiomatic teaching in Judaism, that religion doesn't mean being ascetic and transcendent and living in the higher world. There are many religions, I would say virtually all the world's religions teach that to be spiritual, you have to annul and abjure and exit the material. Right? If you're a Christian, you want to be holy, you have to become a monk or a nun. You dare not engage the material or the sensual. It's fraught with guilt and sense of contamination. Right? Muslims may not even own alcohol, let alone drink it. Right? The Eastern paths all follow a higher path of celibate, ascetic detachment from the world. Right? And our central teaching in Judaism is making a connection between worlds. We cannot tolerate a world that sets apart the spiritual and the material. That is a lack of manifestation of Hashem's being one. The deepest Jewish obsession is Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, he's one. And therefore we are manifesting connection between the world. The act of connecting worlds is called speaking. And that's why the mouth is, and that's why intimacy is called speaking, right? And that's why when you eat, people come together. Right? People come together. You want to make a bond with people, you go out for a meal. And 3 people to eat in Judaism, we have a whole special new way of benching. 10 people, we start getting waxing spiritual about that. We start using Hashem's name when 10 people eat together. And so these ideas are all connected. Let's move to what happened in Egypt. The Egyptians live in the material world. That's what's essential about Egypt. They look to the earth. They use sorcery and magic to control the natural forces. There's no accident that the Egyptians worship the Nile. The Nile is the earth itself giving its bounty. That means the Nile overflows and it waters Egypt. You never have to look up, right? You never have to look up. Like it says, by your feet, you're fertilized. That means Egypt looks down to the material. In Israel, you have to look up to the rain. You have to look up, right? Gesher means rain comes from a higher world. The Egyptian mentality, the Egyptian spirituality, if you like, is to detach the spiritual world from the material. And that means to bond speech, to lock it in so that the spiritual cannot be expressed in the material world. And that was the slavery in Egypt. It's not simply a question of geopolitical domination and having to work to build pyramids. Right? The spiritual battle is to hold the speech of Torah out of the world, to make that block. Pharaoh is this hard back of the neck, which says there's no communication. That world shall forever be separate from this world. And you are locked into our bondage where all the service in the world is only the material for the material. And therefore the Jewish people cannot express themselves. You know what a slave is? A slave is a creature who cannot express himself. The halacha of a slave is whatever the slave does is considered to be the master's action. If a slave acquires something, the halacha is it belongs to the master. A slave is an extension of the master. A slave means he cannot express himself. Whatever expression he brings to the world is an expression of his master. The Jewish people in slavery mean all they can ever express is the values of Egypt, which is pure materialism, pure and utter detachment from the spiritual world. In such a world, Torah cannot be heard. The battle is to break out of that. And therefore, listen carefully, the exodus from Egypt was a shattering of the material. Let's ask a question like this. Why was the exodus from Egypt miraculous? Why'd it have to be miraculous? 10 miracles, 10 plagues, each one more miraculous than the next, and ultimate miracles. When the Nile became blood, it was water for us and blood for them at the same time. It doesn't mean it was rapidly changing. You know, Egyptian took a glass of water, it was blood, and the Jew took it from him, it was water. It doesn't mean that. means both holding the same glass at the same time. At the same time, one and the same substance was water for us and blood for them. When the hail fell with fire inside, right? That particular plague, you know what people think? Let's be honest. People think they were blocks of ice, and inside was a little space. There was a little flame inside the block of ice. It's not what it means. It means it was ice and fire at the same time. These are paradoxical miracles where nature is completely annulled. The Sfas Emes says when the Jewish people transited the sea, they walked on dry land underwater. That's what he says. They walked, and he has to say it, because look at the words in the Torah. Bnei Yisrael halchu bayabasha b'soich. The Torah says literally they walked on dry land in the midst of the ocean, not where the ocean used to be. And that's not what it says. It says twice the Torah says they walked in the midst of the ocean on dry land. Now, 1 second. Did the sea split? Yes. Was it ocean as well? Yes. Is that possible? No. But that's what happened. We're talking, you know, the Rambam writes that on Pesach, you have to tell the children the miracles that were wrought by Moshe. Miracles done by Moses. And we never mention his name. In the Haggadah, we never mention his name. We mention him once only because we don't want to cut a pasuk in half. Excuse me. The Rambam says you have to tell about the miracles that were done by Moshe, and we don't mention his name. And by the way, you know why we don't mention his name? Because the point of Egypt is making direct contact with God. The point of leaving Egypt is to stand at Sinai where we're kissed by the kisses, like he should kiss us with the kisses of his mouth, as it says in Shirashi. The point of the Exodus was to get married to God, a personal, direct experience. And therefore, the Exodus was miraculous. The whole point was to shatter the natural. And that's why the whole meeting of Hashem, right? The finite manifesting, the infinite manifesting in the finite is ultimately paradoxical. But that's what happened. That's what Sinai was for. It was to bond a finite world for the infinite source, with neither one yielding what is in essence paradoxically being held together. And therefore, when the Jewish people leave Egypt, the miracles are the ones, first of all, it has to be miraculous, because the exercise of leaving Egypt is shattering the natural. And not only that, it has to be transcendent miracles, not setting aside nature that fire doesn't burn. How did the story begin? Moshe sees a burning bush at Sinai, the very same site that the Jewish people will later stand at when they meet God face to face. And he saw a bush burning that was not consumed. You know, people think it was like burning. There was like a fire sort of around it. It doesn't mean that. It means it was burning and not burning, right? And that's why when the Torah was finally given, it was given in an ark that had no dimensions. The ark had certain measure. The Holy of Holies had a certain measure. But if you measured from wall to wall or from wall to ark, you got the same measurement. Aron eno min amida. The ark occupies no space. Obviously, this is the place where space comes into being. At that space, at that particular place, space has no meaning. Why are these necessary? Why is this blaze of miracles necessary? The point is it's an exodus from the natural to the miraculous. Look, who could say it better than this? Here are the words of the Rambam. Look it up yourself. In the first few lines of the 7th chapter of the laws of Chometz and Matzah, where the Rambam describes the mitzvah of sitting at the Seder. Please listen carefully, because this is what you have to do in 2 nights' time. He says, this is the first line, mitzvahs eseh shel Torah. It is a positive commandment of the Torah, l'saper, to tell. Now, what must the next words be? Of the exodus from Egypt. Obviously, there must be. Not only that, he goes on to quote the verse that says, remember the day you left Egypt. And listen to his words. It's a positive mitzvah of the Torah to tell of the miracles and wonders that occurred to our forefathers in Egypt. Not a word about the exodus. 1 second. The Torah says very clearly that there's a commandment to tell your children about the exodus from Egypt. And the Rambam says, you know what it means? It means to tell your children that we experienced miracles. What happened to the exodus? You know where the Rambam mentions it? 4 lines later. He says, if you have a child who is very young or mentally very undeveloped, you tell him, my son, my child, we were servants. We were slaves. And so what happened? God took us out and he freed us. That's what you tell a child who's too young to understand anything else. Then you mention the geopolitical event of slavery, freedom, Egypt to Israel. But if the child is any older than that, you tell him, says the Rambam, what you tell the child who's more mature, you tell him, says the Rambam, once again, about the miracles that we experienced in Egypt. You get the idea is this: if you sit at your Pesach Seder and you tell your children we were slaves in Egypt and we were redeemed, we went from Egypt to Israel, we ceased being slaves and we became free people, you're missing the point big time, because that's not the point. The point is not that we move from one place to another or from slavery to freedom. The point is we move from the material to the transcendent. That's the Jewish story. The fact that there was a geopolitical story is not relevant. Every nation has that. You know, I live in England now. You know, the English, the Americans broke away from the English. You know, they didn't like the English. By the way, the South Africans also broke away from the English. They also didn't like the English. Nothing personally I understand. But, you know, every nation has its geopolitical story. That's not what's important. What's important for the Jewish people is that we move from the natural to the miraculous. The whole story of leaving Egypt was a blaze of miracles. Egypt could have been decimated by a stock market collapse. You know, they could have had a cholera epidemic. A lot of things could have happened. That's not the point. And finally, the journey through the desert begins with an ocean splitting where the Jewish people walk underwater on dry land. The point is to move from the natural to the spiritual, to be able to speak Torah in the world, not to be able to. And then finally, the ultimate speech manifests. The ultimate speech, when God himself speaks to us and we receive divine speech in a book of finite words that contain infinite wisdom. And so we become speaking people. And from that moment, Moshe Rabbeinu can speak as well. And therefore, I hope I've explained this well enough, and I hope it's clear to everyone. The concept that we're talking about in Pesach, why is Nissan the first month of the year, the month of speaking? That's what defines the human being. Later, we'll talk about hearing and walking and laughing, and every other month has a different function. But what defines the human being is that we're a speaking being. We are created in a divine image, just like he speaks his own existence into the world in creating it. We are creatures who can speak our existence into the world by speaking. And what's the function of the speech of a human being? To talk about the cricket and the football and all that stuff? No. The function of a human being is to speak Torah in the world, to speak out a message that comes from another world and manifest it in this world. That's being a connector of worlds. That is the function of the Jewish people. Our pinnacle experience is building a temple in which the higher world meets the lower world. And our pinnacle experience as an activity as Jews is to learn Torah, which to speak out in the world a divine wisdom in amazingly, paradoxically, in finite human words. And for the last 4,000 years, right, or 3,300 since Torah was given, that's what we've been doing. And therefore, Pesach, the mouth talks, Haggadah, what we're doing is telling a story. But what we're using our words for to tell a story is to tell a story of transcendence. And that's why the Sfas Emes says we celebrate a Pesach Seder, which means an order. Seder means an order. And what do we do when we celebrate the order? We talk about only things that break the order. And we have the chutzpah to call it a Seder. One miracle after another, each one breaking the natural order, and we call it a Seder. Says the Sfas Emes, that's our Seder. We live in a different order of reality. Look in the second Hagdama, the second introduction of the Maharal to Sefer HaGvuris. Fantastic, very, very rich and very difficult piece. But what he explains there is the miracles have their own order. Miracles don't obey the science as we know it. They obey a transcendent system, right? And the Jewish people move from this one into that one. And that is called ultimately speaking, being able to hear those words of Torah, being able to speak them. And that's the message. And therefore, speech is in exile in Egypt. The Egyptians are holding that captive. And the point is to break out of that. It's synonymous with learning to speak, is learning to break the fetters, if you like, the bonds of the natural and move out into a transcendent reality where we hear something higher and we carry that with us through history. And that is the nature of the Haggadah and the speech of Pesach. So at a deeper level, what we've understood together in this short session is that we are looking to break the bonds of where we are. Let's take a minute or two to answer some questions. I see someone's asking me a question, why Nissan means miracles. That's exactly the point, isn't it? The point of Nissan. Nissan means the month of miracles. The whole point is to move, to begin the year by living our essence, which is moving from the natural into the miraculous. Exactly, yes, very good question. Somebody's asking, why does the Torah say, why do we say on the Haggadah, I and no angel, I and no intermediary? That's exactly the point. The point is that Egypt was a time, Yetzias Mitzrayim is a time, the pinnacle of that experience, when the firstborn are destroyed, is where Hashem himself appears in Egypt, not through any intermediary. Right? That is a moment of pure essence. And in fact, that's what kills the firstborn. And that's called Ani bichvoidi uva'atzmi. My revelation, kavod always means dignified revelation to the outside, uva'atzmi. And that moment, the escalation of the 10 plagues reached that point. And then there's a moment when Hashem himself, so to speak, appears. And at that moment, right, the firstborn representing the essence of what Egypt is are destroyed, and we break out into becoming a newborn people. Yechiel's pointing out that there are many other words for intimacy. That's true as well, of course. It operates on many levels, and human beings manifest free choice as well, indeed. But free choice must have an action, right? When you make a free choice in the world, you use the faculty of Ratzon, and then you express it in your choice in the world. We're not talking about free will simply as abstraction in thought, right? All meaningful human activity, all halachic chalois, that means when halachic reality takes effect in the world, it's only when it's expressed externally in the world. Somebody wants to know what's the difference between lahagid and lesaper. Lahagid means to draw out. Haggadah means to draw out the message and the story. Saper means to tell someone else. And therefore we have both of them. We have Haggadah, which means telling it, and Sipur means telling it to a listener. So those are different nuances in the Hebrew. In the Hashem acts without the intermediary of a human. When he passes over Egypt, that's indeed correct. And when he gives us the Torah, he also manifests in person. But he needs a human being to be standing there. And when he manifests in Egypt, he leaps over the Jewish homes. He needs us to be performing certain actions, and that's the measure of that level of miracle. Okay, let's thank Ariel and Bina again for hosting this. Let me thank you all for joining this session. Thank you for joining the newsletter. It's my pleasure to send those out from time to time, and it's also my pleasure to do these sessions occasionally. Thanks for the support on a personal level, and thanks for financial support once again for those people who make their contributions at the website. And I repeat again, this is not necessary entirely. We intend to keep doing what we do anyway, but I certainly appreciate that people are with me. Please look out for my new book. It goes into some of what we've discussed now about Shabbos and the festivals. I hope you'll enjoy that. Any feedback, you're always ready to hear. Enjoy hearing feedback. Just as you are receiving the newsletter at the website, you can certainly always email me. I see those emails every few days, so please feel free to stay in touch. Thank you very much. Let me wish everyone a wonderful Pesach of speaking the right words, speaking words of Torah, and bringing out spiritual essence in the world, being able to speak those words and to hear them. All the best, everyone.